saying, we've already sort of introduced you.
Yes.
So Nanna is a partner at Novo Ventures. You've also been involved at Novo Seeds.
That's right.
Before, and you also have a background as a researcher. I think you were at the Cancer Research UK, so you are also familiar with the science side. So I guess since we already talked about the investment process in a company from the point of view of my breed, I want to hear what your experience was with this investment. So why did you decide? How did you decide investing in a company such as IO Biotech, and what role do you play at these early stages?
Yeah, I mean, I think Maj-Britt has already given a great introduction. I think when we started looking at IO Biotech as an investment opportunity, of course, it was an unusual situation that there was already a published paper with clinical data. It was a small study, sort of 14, 15 patients, as I recall it, and without a control group, or without a real control group. But where there was already very encouraging clinical signs of efficacy. And also at this time, as Maj-Britt was saying, the whole immuno-oncology field was really exploding, and this was a very interesting sort of orthogonal approach of using an immune response, but directed at regulatory T cells rather than directed at cancer-associated antigens. So from that perspective, it was quite novel. But it was an immune oncology approach that was targeting both negative immune cells, but also tumor cells themselves. So I think that's, it was, in terms of the theme or the area, it was a very opportune moment, and then there was a combination of both good clinical data and I think a very strong founder group, both with Maj-Britt and Hans was also a founder in the company, and then Marcel Andersen and Inge-Marie Svane, who are some of the leading sort of translational immuno-oncologists in Copenhagen, and Inge-Marie is certainly sort of internationally renowned as well, and has been lead investigator on a lot of the PD-1 and CTLA-4 trials that have taken place in Copenhagen as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a very strong starting point. Yeah.
So were you involved at the beginning in steering the company to a certain direction, or?
Yeah, we had a lot of discussions between the three of us for a long time about how we could sort of try and bridge the gap between these very interesting and compelling clinical observations, but with the limitation that it was a fairly small data set, mm-hmm. and obviously it's always hard to really draw very solid mechanistic conclusions on the basis of such a small data set, because obviously that you have to take into account the baseline demographics or the natural history of each individual patient as well, mm-hmm. to really understand what these data mean, and to do that and sort of generalize how this mechanism would work in a broader population was kind of impossible. And so we spent a lot of time trying to think about were there translational studies we could do, how could we build out the data package so that in addition to building out additional clinical data, which is coming now, sort of 5 mm-hmm. years down the line, but would also be able to build out a stronger sort of preclinical and translational data package. And I think, it was a great learning process, I think, for all of us, and I think also put us into contact with some of the people that actually now have been advisors of IO Biotech, and I think people who were extremely helpful during that company formation phase, but also became so enthusiastic about both the substance of the project, but also the other people involved, that they've chosen to remain associated with the company and serve as scientific advisors.
Yeah. And so for sure, with all these investments, you get involved with a lot of different companies. I guess you also learn a lot from what they do right, what they do wrong. So I think one quite successful company that you've worked with is Orphazyme.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a bit more about this company and what things you think they did particularly right, or what kind of learnings you can take away from it?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So, Orphazyme is based in this building as well, and I think has been really a tremendous success story. It started as a publication in Nature, I think, from the scientific founder, and then they raised a lot of money and developed this product, and they've now filed for approval. So with a bit of luck, they could have a product actually available to patients within the next 12-15 months. So very exciting, and I think it's certainly a company that Novo Holdings, I think, are very proud to have been associated with. I think one thing they really did right was again working with the right people from the outset. So I think they were very good at reaching out to academics who were experts in this field and trying to associate them as advisors early on, and trying to learn about this very rare disease, Niemann-Pick type C, that they're developing as their lead indication, trying to understand from clinicians who treat children with this disorder about the natural history of the disease, and engaging these people as advisors to help them design the clinical trial that they completed almost 2 years ago now. So I think, again, to Maj-Britt's point, engaging with the clinical experts in the field as early as possible, and trying to associate them as tightly as you possibly can to the company, because I think it's also a real endorsement that leading scientists who have a million other things to do are choosing to spend their time on a project that they believe in and that they're passionate about. And then I think the other thing they did right was raise a lot of money very quickly. So that allowed them to really build the company from the outset, and I think they had a very compelling story. I think they had very strong data, but I think they also, similarly to Biotech, I guess, kind of in playing into the immuno-oncology theme, Orphazyme was very much playing into the rare disease, orphan disease space, which was becoming very popular at the time. So I think actually had quite a relatively easy time of attracting investment, both first from Novo Seeds, actually, with partly from Stefan's help, but this was before I joined Novo, and then subsequently raised a fairly significant Series A financing round, even though they were fairly early on in their development. And then during the time that I was involved with the company, we raised significant additional money from European investors, and then finally took the company public, I guess 2 years ago now.
So do you think things like this, reaching out to scientists, to advisors early on, is this a common struggle for many companies that are starting out?
No, I don't think it's a common struggle. I think it's a common theme that most companies try to do it. I think what is important is to kind of be humble to the task and be fairly modest about, even though, so for Thomas and Anders, who started Orphazyme, I think they knew a lot about the specific pathway that they were intervening with, but obviously neither of them had been physicians treating Niemann-Pick disease, and so you have to acknowledge that there's sort of decades of experience in the heads of the people that have been in that role that you need to gain access to somehow, and I think that's when we think about companies that don't succeed, even if they manage to develop a product, but in terms of have a drug that intervenes with a pharmacological target, but it's not successful, I think it's usually because they haven't understood the unmet need well enough, or they haven't understood the clinical development path well enough. And that there's no way of going back and fixing that once you're 5-6 years down the line of development.
Yeah, sure. So I think also, as we mentioned in the previous discussion, something everyone can learn from is difficult time challenges. And I think one example of a company you were involved with was Forendo Pharma. I think they encountered some safety issues in their preclinical trials, but they managed to sort of deal with them. So can you tell us a bit more about what happened, how they dealt with it, what was done right?
Yeah, sure. It really should be Stefan answering this question since he was on the board at the time, but we both worked with the company. So in Forendo, this was a company that had a number of different programs that were spun out from a previous company, and we invested primarily because we were very enthusiastic about a program for endometriosis, which was preclinical at the time we made the investment, and the investment we made was structured to take this into the clinic and to show human proof of concept of this mechanism. momentum. And then during the sort of IND-enabling tox studies, some tox findings came up, which basically meant that this lead molecule couldn't be advanced any further. And this was obviously a big dent in our investment thesis, but also a big challenge for the company, because actually the investment was structured in tranches, as is common for early stage companies. And in order to draw down the next tranche, they really needed to advance the molecule into the clinic. And luckily, I think for the company, and very creatively, some of these other assets they had from a previous company that we hadn't paid any attention to, or that we hadn't really made as part of our investment thesis. One of these was actually a clinical stage program for hypogonadism in men, and through sheer tenacity and creativity, I think on behalf of the founder team, they managed to strike a reasonable deal for one of these programs and get both some cash, but also some equity upside from a small US listed biotech company. And even though it wasn't a huge amount of money, it was a very significant amount of money for the company at the time, when they wouldn't really have been in a position to go out and raise new equity financing, because the lead program had just been put back for several years, and that actually managed to extend their runway and give them enough sort of a cash buffer to persuade the investment syndicate to sort of say, okay, well actually we have backup molecules, it's going to take longer, but we're going to be able to find a way through. And I think it's, as you said, it's had a very happy ending now with one of those backups now being in the clinic and looking very promising.
Mm-hmm. So May-Britt mentioned also the example of a company she was involved with that it turned out it was a bit too early for the technology to go into a business. So as an investor, how do you decide when to invest in a company? Like when is the right moment to get in?
Well, I think it's one of these where hindsight is 20/20. I think we've had other examples of companies that we've started where in hindsight it turned out to be too early. So I mean, one company we started was a Swedish company called GlioNova, spin out from the Karolinska Institute. Very, very exciting preclinical data published in Cell, and tremendous amount of academic data that was sort of positioning a new mechanism to treat glioblastoma, which is a horrible disease with very, very poor treatment options, and we started a company around it in order to facilitate taking one of these molecules into clinical development. And in parallel with preparing for clinical development, we also wanted to repeat and expand on the preclinical findings that had really been the underpinnings of the company. And it turned out we couldn't, and we ended up unwinding the company before moving forward into the clinic, because we simply couldn't repeat the preclinical findings and come up with a strong enough rationale to take it forward. So in hindsight, it was too early, and we should have maybe kept it in the university setting for another year or two and tried to repeat these findings. But I think it was. I don't think there was any way of knowing at the time. I think in hindsight, I think we can see maybe some of the things that were not done in an optimal way in terms of the original experiments. But I don't think there was really any way of finding out. And I think similarly, we've had other companies that we've started. Recovery, for example, is a spin-out from Aarhus University. We started a long time ago with a novel target, and there's always a huge risk with a novel target. Are you going to be able to actually find chemistry to drug that target? And I think there was a company that was well funded, but got money both from the Wellcome Trust and from a number of different investors, both from Novo but also from others, and had all the right input and expertise, but at least in the time and with the money available, we just couldn't find a molecule that was good enough to take forward. So I think that's, unfortunately, it's kind of the risk of early stage biotech to some extent. I'm not sure whether there's a way of addressing it other than as an investor, obviously you can choose to say I will only invest in things that have already been in the clinic, or where there's already a preclinical candidate, or whatever you choose as a cutoff. But
for a company, for example, or for someone considering whether to spin out a company, what would you say is the minimum they should have for them to be ready to actually start looking for investment?
I'm not sure it's possible to come up with a definitive checklist, because I think if you look at some of the companies that have been started in the last 5 years or so, for example, in gene editing or in new gene therapy platforms, I mean, a lot of those would be super early stage technologies, certainly without any clinical data, but also oftentimes without a very deep preclinical data package. But because these are areas that there's so much enthusiasm, so much excitement around, with the right team and with the right story, it's still been possible for some of these companies to raise huge amounts of money and at least build a very successful story so far. I mean, I think all the gene editing companies are a case in point. I don't think Intellia or CRISPR are in the clinic or even approaching it. So even though they've both gone public and raised huge amounts of money. But I mean, I think I could say what we would look for, even for an early stage company, if there's no clinical data, if we're only looking at preclinical data, we would normally look for multiple angles of validation. So either that there's multiple different models where we've seen convincing effects, that the effects have been shown in more than one group, more than one laboratory. If it's all been shown in the single founding lab, I think we would always be a little bit more cautious, and would ideally like to see that those critical experiments could be repeated at an external CRO, for example. Another thing we look for is some sort of linearity of science backed up by human genetic data, for example, or large animal models. With some inherited diseases, you have spontaneous, dog models or similar, where you can see quite relevant proof of concept as translation. So I think those are sort of the pieces of the puzzle that we would typically look for.
All right, yeah. And in terms of, because I know at Novo Ventures you invest not only at early stages, also later in the development. So what are the differences between investing in companies at different stages? What are the different needs of these companies?
Well, I'd say when you're investing early stage, as with Biotech or with Orphazyme, I think it's actually a much more involved process. You're much more sort of thinking together as a team, and I think with the investors as well as the entrepreneurs, trying to think about how to move the project forward, how to prioritize the limited resources you have in the beginning, and trying to think about how to best position the story, both in terms of attracting other investors, attracting potential collaborators, attracting great management. So I think you're very much sort of on the same team, I think, and I think that is a little bit different when you're coming into the company as a later stage investor, where really a lot more of the work is done up front, where it's much more of a deep and detailed due diligence and analysis. But if there's already a very seasoned executive team that has planned out what is the next clinical trial we're doing, and where does the company need to get to in the next 2 years, it's a little bit more of a question of sort of doing the analysis, putting the money, and then turning the card. Okay. But to some extent, the management team is more doing the executing, if you like, because there's less of a company creation element to it when you're investing at a later stage. Okay, so it's easier in general to do it at later stages? I wouldn't say it's easier. I mean, I think it has different challenges, and it also has the different challenges that typically there can be a little bit more of a misalignment between the investors that have come in early and the investors that have come in late, that you've typically paid different prices and you've had different holding periods in the company, so there might be differences of different economic incentives to pursue different paths for the company. So you can have a lot more friction and discussion, I think, in the investor group in that scenario. Okay. Whereas I think in an early stage company, it's usually more that everyone is kind of fighting the same battle, which is to raise the next round of financing and propel the project forward, whatever is sort of the obvious next stage. So is this something you take into account? Like, for example, if you're going to invest in a later stage company, which investors they already have, and whether you align with their plan? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's actually a very important consideration, and in particular where if it's a company that has already been found, been in existence, had their first financing round maybe 7-8 years ago, it typically means that those first funds will be very very much pushing to sell the company, and will probably be happy to sell the company at a much lower amount than you would coming in as a later stage investor. And whereas if we're only coming in at a later round, maybe we would rather put more money into the company, build a bigger company, try to take the company public, for example, and that might not be something that the earlier funds would be interested in, because maybe they don't have enough follow-on capital to continue to follow their investment. So that's sort of the classical conflict, I guess, between early and late stage investors.
For sure. All right. Do we have any questions for Nanna? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm just very curious about curious to know about a situation where you see a project which has fantastic science and you're very enthusiastic about it, but you're not so sure about the founding team, and whether that's always a walk-away situation, or if you can somehow fill the skills gaps in a way that doesn't upset people.
In a way that doesn't upset people, no. I'd say that's pretty much impossible. Usually there are differences of opinion about how to fill the skills gap, as you put it. I would say that on the face of it, it sounds like it's very easy in the sense for the investors to simply change the management, because we're putting in the money and we'll make some shareholders agreement that means that we decide everything. But it's actually still a very difficult thing to do. And I think in reality, it cost the company a year to go through that exercise, in terms of where the development does not really move forward, or does not move forward at the same pace that it would have otherwise, because a lot of decisions end up getting kind of kicked into the long grass, and kind of, well, we don't want to decide this now because the new CEO is coming in 3 months, and he or she is going to have an opinion about what kind of CBO we're hiring, or whatever it is. So a lot of other things end up being on standby whilst you're going through that process of changing the CEO. So it's not an easy fix, I think, ever. So I think you have to be super excited about the technology if you think that the current management team is not backable. I think there's a different situation where you think super exciting science, attractive deal terms, management is okay for this stage, but in time we'll need to change the management, I think, and that can be a bit of a different situation. Also because I think you can have a first-time CEO that can really grow into the role if you hire other experienced people around him or her. If you have a really strong chairman, you hire an experienced CFO, for example, maybe the person has potential to evolve into the role. So I think that's sort of the in-between scenario, but I would say I don't know, I've been in lots of situations where even though there's been a lot of agreement actually around the table, maybe even with the incumbent CEO, that a new CEO needs to be hired, and it just takes up so much time and so much energy that it really diverts attention from otherwise moving the company forward. So it's not a simple exercise.
You had another question? Yeah.
Hi. So I'm just curious because Novo does different kind of fundings.
Yeah.
But I don't know how the foundation and venture is kind of related or interlinked.
Sure.
They also do seed grants.
Sure.
And then mostly venture companies are like trying to invest in a later stage, especially when the company is with the good development of proof of concept, or like involved in more clinical trials or something.
Yeah.
So how does, can you explain a little bit more, like what kind of projects are attractive for the seed grant, and what kind of stage that the venture company would be interested in?
Sure. So I think you're talking about a few different things there. So one is the pre-seed grants, which are actual grants, and then there's the investment from Novo Seeds, and then there's investment from Novo Ventures. So the remit for the pre-seed grants is actually changing, and I don't want to say something wrong, so I'm going to defer to Bobby, who's here somewhere, who can probably elaborate. But in terms of which companies are suitable for Novo Seeds or Novo Ventures, I think, for a project that's been recently spun out of academia, or is a project that you're thinking about spinning out from a university, then almost always it will be more suitable for Novo Seeds, because that's what we do in Novo Seeds, is help to start companies and put the first money in and help to build the team around it. Within Novo Ventures, we do typically look at more mature companies. It can still be a Series A financing round, but it would typically be a much larger financing round. So it's mainly to do with how much money we're investing and how advanced the company is. So I mean, in Novo Ventures, our typical investment size is sort of in the 10 to 20 million euros or dollars in a single round of investment, and typically in a syndicate with others. So the total investment round would be 30 to 50 or 60 million. Whereas in Novo Seeds, we would happily put in the first half, 2-3 million euros as first investor, and help to syndicate the first round of investment, which might be more in the 5 to 10 million range.
I'm sorry, last question. As a stakeholder,
yeah,
how much Novo is involved with the company that it funded?
Novo Ventures or Novo Seeds?
Novo Ventures.
Yeah, we're typically very involved in the sense that we typically play the role of a lead investor. So we would normally have a board seat, and we would normally have a lot of rights in terms of what the shareholder agreement would dictate. So typically, if we invest in a syndicate of 3 investors, we would make a shareholder agreement that 2 out of the 3 investors, for example, decide to raise more money, to make a license agreement, to change the business plan, etc. That I think that would be a typical sort of governance structure.
So does that vary with the seats?
What's
Since
that?
You asked me whether seats are ventures. Does that vary with the seats, or is
No, I mean, I think with seeds, the thing that varies is that seeds can often be the sole investor to begin with, and in that case would have obviously the dominant say without having other investors to take into account. I think in Novo Ventures we do have a few investments where we're the sole investor, but it's 2 or 3 out of a portfolio of more than 50 companies, so it's very much not the norm.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering, you say you invest usually in a syndicate of different ventures,
Yeah.
right? Is there a culture difference? Is it easier or harder to work with other ventures if they're from the US or compared to the EU, or?
No, not so much. I mean, I think the main... I think it usually comes down to the individual. I think it's, I think certain venture firms definitely do have a particular culture. Some can have more sharp elbows than others, or be more collaborative, more consensus driven than others. But I think in any firm, it still comes down to each individual person. So, I mean, I think, the people I work with in other boards, in other portfolio companies, I mean, I might work with one partner out of 10 or 15, however big the firm is, and he or she would be my only point of interaction. So I think it very much comes down to sort of individual relationships, but I don't actually think that nationalities is that important in that respect. It's really much more sort of personality types.
Sorry, is there any other venture firm that Novo Ventures has been like, we don't work with this?
Yeah, we have had conflicts in the past, but again, I would say that so there was a conflict before I joined Novo Ventures, but I knew the company in question because in the fund I worked in previously, we looked at the same company and became aware that there was this big conflict, and it was the company got sold, and there was a big discussion about what exactly the agreement said with regards to liquidation preferences and who was getting which part of the spoils. So I mean, it's probably something that's, I don't know, 8-9 years in the past now, and subsequently I've worked with other partners from that same firm because the conflict was really between one of my previous colleagues and one of their previous colleagues. So by the time that other people are doing different things, then it sort of it goes away to some extent. But I think also I don't know, the venture industry is actually very small, and in particular in Europe, so it's not really in anyone's interest to have bad blood to the extent that you don't want to work together, because that really limits your possibilities for syndicating interesting opportunities.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So I wanted to ask, you talked about involving people in the clinic into the firms very early.
Yeah.
So what works in attracting talent within the clinic to early stage companies?
Having a really exciting story, I think. Yeah, I mean, whenever we're looking at a new investment opportunity, we'll also try and reach out to clinicians and to really understand, how do you treat these patients today? How do you diagnose them? How does the disease progress? How many clinical trials are ongoing? Would you be able to, if I invested into this company, would they actually be able to recruit patients, find patients to recruit into this trial? And I find a lot of the time, that maybe the first 1 or 2 calls you have, depending on how much background reading you've done in advance, can be a little bit hard because you're trying to learn yourself. But the more knowledgeable you are about an area, and the more that you can speak to them about it maybe not as a peer, because obviously you're never going to have the same level of knowledge, but nonetheless as someone who is interested and engaged and knowledgeable about their area, usually people are actually incredibly enthusiastic to share their expertise. And so I think if you have an approach and you are if you're good at articulating why is this going to be meaningful for their patients, I think you'd be surprised at how many people will talk to you for free and really be enthusiastic about discussing how can we take this forward. But it is very much, so I think I find when I speak to clinicians, some clinicians can be very astute to the underlying biology and translational science, and I think in particular in oncology actually people are incredibly knowledgeable. But in a lot of other therapeutic areas, the clinicians really think about how do I treat my patient, and what's the next new treatment, how can it help. They might not be super interested in discussing all the underlying biochemistry, and they might not even be that knowledgeable about it, even if they understand that this disease is due to a mutation in this receptor, but they're not necessarily thinking about all the other signaling pathways you could intervene with in order to make a difference. But if you can articulate, we think this is our animal data, this is what this means, this is how we think this might be translated, and get them enthusiastic about how this can be meaningful, I think you'll have a very positive response. So it is very much about kind of trying to articulate in a way that makes it meaningful for them, right?
Yep.
Hi.
Hello.
I was just wondering whether you talk a little bit about when you're considering whether or not you invest, what extent you consider the IP held by a potential company, and how that might change with the stage of the company.
I would say we always consider the IP, and we have walked away from investments because we thought the IP was too poor or too inadequate. But it usually comes at a fairly, I'd say that it's not something that most investors are very expert at assessing, so, myself certainly included. So what I would normally do is, you would ask about what is the IP position, but you sort of almost have to take it at face value, whatever the company tells you. If it's a small molecule and they have a composition of matter patent filed, then normally that's a fairly strong position. But then normally what would happen is you would conduct the rest of your diligence first, and then once you're at the point where you've agreed a term sheet, then you would commission an IP attorney to look through in detail. And because that's quite costly, so you wouldn't necessarily incur that cost before being quite confident that if everything else is okay, then you go ahead and do the IP diligence. If that checks out, you'd go ahead and make the investment. because typically that would be your cost as an investor to carry out that IP diligence if you then walk away from the deal. So you don't want to have too many of those, because I mean it can be, you know, hundreds of thousands. So yeah.
Thank you.
Hi.
I mean, being on the side of the venture capital side, you get to see a lot of biotech ecosystems.
Yeah.
And what is your opinion? So, what's your opinion on the Danish biotech ecosystem, where you have a few global pharmaceutical companies, then within the last year, companies like Sniper Biome, Stipe, raising double digits, creating some spark. So, what do you see the future of Danish biotech ecosystem in terms of growth opportunities versus gaps?
I wish I had a crystal ball. I think the Danish biotech ecosystem is actually in pretty good shape for the reasons you mentioned. So I think there's both obviously very good universities, very supportive funding environment, quite a number of venture funds, even though it might not seem that way from here, but considering the size of the population, I think the amount of venture money available ratio to GDP or per capita is actually pretty good, and the fact that we do have 3 global companies with R&D headquarters here, I think gives a great access to talent as well. So I think it's actually in a very strong starting position. The limitation is that it's small, right? I mean, it is small. It's a small country, and I think even if we're punching above our weight in terms of the size of the country, it is still small. So I think the limitation is that you have to be able to recruit internationally. You have to be able to attract international talent to the companies. I think it's super encouraging and exciting to see that so many companies are doing just that, either persuading Danes who've been working abroad for many years to come back to Denmark, or persuading some people from the US or from other countries to relocate here, or finding ways to work remotely. But there's no way of kind of bridging that gap. And I mean, I have the same challenge in my job. I don't have any current portfolio companies that are based in Denmark. So you just have to be willing to spend a lot of time on the phone and spend a lot of time traveling. But I think as long as people are willing to do that, I think there's great opportunities here. I also think the fact that Copenhagen is such a nice place to live, and it's quite widely internationally recognized as such, I think is actually a real competitive advantage as well, because a lot of the other biotech hubs are a lot more expensive, a lot lower quality of life than Copenhagen, which I think when I speak to academics, scientists that come to Copenhagen, is also what encourages them either to come or maybe encourages them to stay. So I think that's sort of on the plus side, but it's something that I think for the local companies you have to kind of continue to work at.
Okay. Do we have another question? Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
So to my best understanding, you invest not only in the Scandinavian companies, but also to other countries and companies.
Yeah, that's right.
So do you see a difference between startups and the amount of them in Scandinavia and the rest of the Europe?
Not really. I think so. We've actually recently been doing some analysis on kind of what are the big clusters in Europe, both in terms of companies, how much money is raised in different areas, which countries and clusters have the biggest number of companies that either get acquired or go public. And I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone that the UK is the biggest cluster in Europe, followed by Switzerland, and then probably Benelux in third place, and then sort of France, Scandinavia, roughly equal. And I think, again, if we think about the size of Scandinavia compared to these other clusters, Scandinavia is significantly smaller in terms of population, so we are well represented. But I think if we think about all the different kind of metrics, where there are most funds, where there's been most money raised, most M&As, most IPOs, it tracks pretty much the ranking I mentioned. So I think we're doing very well. I don't think there are any sort of particular differences country to country. I think another interesting data point is that I think about 10 years ago, if you looked at the sort of first rounds of investments and early stage company founding, the majority of that investment across Europe came from local funds. So typically sort of government-backed innovation funding. And whereas actually now, a lot more money is coming from funds that are not located in the same country as the company, and even coming from funds outside Europe, both from China and from US. And I think that really speaks to the fact that Europe as a whole is really maturing as a kind of biotech ecosystem, that better companies are being created, and also there's been I guess there's been a sort of sorting the stronger companies from the less strong ones, both during the financial crisis, both on the company side, but also on the investor side. I think investment firms that weren't able to live through the financial crisis have withered and died, and the ones that are still around are the ones that somehow managed to have a strong enough portfolio to see it through. So I think there's been definitely an increase in quality in terms of both entrepreneurs and investors, so that it's a more mature ecosystem now.
Thank you.
I think we have one more at the back.
Just a question regarding the US, because you asked Maj-Britt whether they are considering opening an office, and I'm also working with companies which are much earlier stage and already looking at the US. What do you think would be the right timing for considering such a move? And I would be concerned that it takes the focus away from the early discovery work already starting to expand. And so what do, from your experience, think is the right timing for such a step?
Yeah, I wish I had a definitive answer. I think because the public markets in the last few years have been so buoyant, almost 9 out of 10 business plans we see at the moment is like, oh, this is the last round of financing before we're going public in the US, and we're starting up our US office. That's sort of and you can no longer say that it's too early, because you have all these preclinical companies going public. So you can understand why people want to pursue this. But I tend to agree with you that it can also be too early when you're still actually developing the technology. I think going public as a preclinical company may be possible if you're in a super exciting gene editing, gene therapy area. I think for almost everything else, even for very kind of high-flying, exciting oncology platforms, they might be preclinical data, but they tend to be in phase 1 when they are able to address public markets. So I would say that if that's within a year, 18 months of your development plan, then maybe it makes sense to start thinking about it. If you're still trying to develop the technology or still in discovery phase, I would say stick to that. That's more important. And also I think for an early stage company, it's very important to have the right level of input and to not limit yourself to people that have their postcode in Copenhagen. But that's not the same as to say you need to have an office in Boston, right? So there's lots of different ways of accessing expertise.
Okay. Have any more questions? One more?
Just one, actually.
Sure.
Since we are Medicon Valley Alliance is a Danish-Swedish life science cluster organization, I'm a bit curious if you could elaborate a little bit on, from your perspective, what are the main differences when you look at Denmark, Copenhagen, and Sweden?
Oh, difficult one. I think the main difference is that in Sweden there's a really strong angel investment culture, for better and for worse, because I think it obviously can be a real opportunity for early stage companies to attract financing much earlier than they would be able to in Denmark, or in Denmark they would be stuck with the likes of us in overseas or Novo Ventures, who are maybe going to have a more difficult discussion with them about valuation and about governance than someone who's made their money in a different sector and doesn't know anything about venture. So I don't want to sort of just say it's a negative, because obviously it can be a huge positive for the companies, but I think it does put a lot of these companies in a difficult position later on if they then, after they've raised maybe 20 or 30 or 40 million Swedish, they want to raise a venture round and the valuation has gone very, very far ahead of where the technology has developed to, and if they want to take money from the likes of us, they need to go back to their private investors and have a very tough discussion about the valuation that we've told you over the last number of share issues is going to be reset at a much lower level. I think that's the main difficulty, and then it's not just been in the private companies; it's also been in the public markets, right? Because there's been all these first north introductions of again very early stage companies, and I think it's great if it can be a stepping stone for these companies to raise financing and then graduate to the main market, and some have done that very successfully, but it can also end up being a sort of downward spiral where your market cap gets smaller and smaller. The amount of money you can raise is a percentage of your market cap, so you can raise smaller and smaller amounts that are not really meaningful in bringing the technology forward, and that's not a helpful situation. And I would say that we would normally just, even if the technology is exciting, it's not a structure that we would want to engage with, and we would sort of say, well, actually, you have to figure out a way of fixing this first, and then we would be happy to look at the technology in a different context.
We had one more, yeah.
I just have too many questions.
That's okay.
So as a follow-up question to what the concern that she raised, I just recently came to know that even if you get like a travel grant from the foundation that is associated with tobacco research, tobacco industry or such, then you get blacklisted for like 10 years.
Okay.
Due to like ethical
from whom?
concerns and
Who's blacklisting you?
Like Danish Cancer Society, like a Lüneborg Foundation, Carlsberg Foundation, even by Novo Foundation.
Okay.
So how does that ethical value stands with Novo Ventures? Like, what is Novo Ventures' expectation?
That's a very difficult question. I'm not sure I've ever asked anyone if they'd ever had a grant from a tobacco company. I do think we have. It's true that we do have to sort of oblige with various ethical standards of saying, we don't think the company is involved in money laundering or terrorist activities or anything like this. But I mean, usually that's pretty easy to say. I don't think so. It doesn't really seem relevant. I mean, money laundering is, it tends to be a cash-generative business. Biotech is more of a cash-using business. So yeah, no, I'm sorry, I can't give a better answer. I don't know.
All right, then thanks a lot, Nanna, for all your great answers and everyone for your questions.
Thanks everyone for your questions.